And joining us now for the full hour on the debate in Austin, Texas, Simone Browne. She is a professor of sociology at the University of Texas, Austin. And here in studio, Jordan Peterson, clinical psychologist and professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. Peter Timmerman, professor with the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University. Geoff Pevere, entertainment columnist with the Toronto Star. And Michael Coren, host of, I love this word, the eponymously named program on CTS and the author of As I See It. Good to have everybody around the table here in Toronto. And Simone, we can say hello from your old hometown. You're from here, even though you're down there. Nice to have you on the program tonight. We're all gathered here, of course, because the Academy Awards are this weekend. Many people, won't say everybody, but many people are expecting big things for Avatar at the Academy Awards. And a lot of the issues raised in the movie have prompted a bit of a firestorm of controversy and discussion on a range of issues. So we're going to get into all of that tonight. But before we go to the sort of conversation up here, sorry, Geoff, not to suggest that film criticism is down here, but let's just talk about this.
It may well be these days, but yeah.
Let's just talk about this as a movie. This is the #1 movie of all time, right? $2.5 billion in sales right now. Why do you think the film, as a film, is so successful?
Well, I think it's largely because of the 3D technology. I think that if there is one thing that we can not argue in terms of Avatar's demonstrable achievement, it is that it has kicked in a new era of movie technology, and I think also expectations for the kind of entertainment technologically that movies will need to provide for people in the future. This is it. 3D has come. Avatar has brought it. Apart from that, it ain't much of a movie.
Okay. Simone, get off the fence and tell me what you really think, okay? Simone, why do you think the picture was such a hit?
I think I have to echo Geoff there. It was just the technology was meant to be spectacular, this 3D technology, but a kind of one-dimensional story, and I think it was just something new that the public wanted to see.
Michael, do you like it?
Lots of hype.
I thought it was the finest piece of work ever. No, it was rubbish. It was, and I don't say this as the cynic who has to say that popular work is not entertaining. I loved Star Wars, the innocence of it. X-Men I thought was a beautifully made movie. I went there with my family, with a 12-year-old. I wanted to like this thing. I love the 3D stuff. It was putrid. It was badly acted. It was derivative. It was hackneyed. It was cliched. I was bored after about an hour and a half. And I wish I could say otherwise. I thought it was dreadful. Was I surprised? The man who gave us Titanic and the Jesus tomb? No, I wasn't surprised at all, really.
Okay, Jordan?
Well, I thought it was beautiful. And I think part of the reason it was popular, apart from its specific technological appeal, was that it also appealed to people because of the idea of the avatar. Of course, because you're an avatar in a video game, and it's an impressive modern idea. So I think he hit the interest of the public right on the button.
Peter?
I think it was an act of eco-cultural deforestation. I think it bulldozed its way through mythology, film, the environment. I thought it was a catastrophe as a film, and I'm a devout environmentalist. I thought it was a travesty, and I'm just shocked that so many people are taking it to their bosoms. This is a book about Avatar, taking it to their bosoms as if somehow it's the great story about the environment and nature. I'm just very depressed about the whole
I've changed my mind. I think it was a great movie.
Big support around the table tonight.
I'm glad to see so much love and support for this motion picture, and I can't imagine there's any, well, I'm sure there are a few people out there who haven't seen it, and if you haven't seen it, it is a beautiful movie, and here's a bit of what it looks like. Roll tape, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, you are not in Kansas anymore. You are on Pandora.
You should see your faces.
We have an indigenous population called the Na'vi. They are very hard to kill.
This is why we're here. Because this little gray rock sells for $20 million a kilo. Their village happens to be resting on the richest deposit, and they need to relocate. Those savages are threatening our whole operation. We're on the brink of war, and you're supposed to be finding a diplomatic solution.
That's the trailer from Avatar. Jordan, you study the psychology of myths, and I'd like to know what established myths you see in this motion picture.
Well, myths have a pretty standard structure, and one of the standard representations in myth is nature, and nature can be represented sort of positively, like it was in the Avatar, or it can be represented as something to conquer, justly conquer, like it is in most Westerns. So that's the heroic individual moving wonderful culture into the despoiled wilderness. Well, this movie has exactly the opposite structure of that. So nature is put forward as something that's pristine and perfect, and technology and culture is portrayed as rapacious. So it's like, it's an anti-Western. That's one way of looking at it.
Okay, Peter, your expertise is environmental studies, and many people have observed that this is an environmentalist film. What do you say to that?
Well, for a start, the ecology of the planet makes no sense. I mean, you have a huge gas planet next door to it, so presumably the gravity would destroy everything on the planet. When you actually read, there's a book about this, it has all the biology and ecology in it. The planet is supposed to be a planet with more nitrogen and oxygen. Well, if there's more oxygen, the planet would catch fire. There are...
So you're saying the science isn't perfect on this?
Well, actually, the interesting thing is that they got all these people. They got an exobiologist, they got an astrobiologist, they got a woman, an ethnomusicologist, and they created this book which has actually all these plants and all these things. So it actually could have been a very rich ecological movie, instead of which I mean, there's more real sort of ecological substance in Pocahontas or in the film that I'm fond of, which is Fern Gully, which is a film which actually has an ecosystem of fairies involved in it. I mean, I think the film, the environmental quality of the film, the real sort of deep message of the film, which is what I'm most offended by, is not the struggle over large bulldozers and the rest of it, which I'm in favor of struggling against large bulldozers. But the fundamental deep metaphor of the film is that you can plug directly into nature the way you plug directly into the internet. The unobtainium, which is what I used to call upsidasium in Bullwinkle cartoons, was called upsidasium. It's now called unobtainium. One of the few witty things in the actual film is that this unobtainium is a superconductor. And the superconductor is going to help people connect. And so one of the things that's going on in this film, I call it hypernature. What's going on in this film is part of the pathological situation we find ourselves in, where people are so disjointed and so disconnected from nature that they actually have to go into a movie theater in order to get an experience of nature, which is a sort of travesty of what an actual jungle, how a jungle functions and how the natural world functions.
But these criticisms that you have, Geoff, does it fail as a movie because of these criticisms that Peter's identified?
No, but I think that what Peter is doing is he's zeroing in on the important next level of distraction from the fact that it is a terrible movie. I think a lot of this discussion about the environmentalism of Avatar, whether or not it is racist, all of that kind of stuff, basically distracts from the fact that it is, as Michael pointed out, it's not that it's a popular entertainment that makes it so awful. It's the fact that it's awful that makes it so awful.
Yes.
It is a script written by a man for whom no one is able to say, Jim, maybe we ought to work on this a little bit more. So we can talk about the technology, we can talk about the issues, we can talk about the Oscars, but the fact is, at the core, it is one of the most inept scripts ever to become this popular.
I thought he spent 14 years on this.
That's what he's claiming. He claims that he spent 14 years.
This is like a latter George Lucas, when people couldn't say to him, George, this is rubbish, this is really bad, you've got to do this again, because of his early success, and thus the latter Star Wars movies are very poor. Tolkien, if we want to talk about environmentalism, mythology, and good against evil, I read a book about Tolkien. Doesn't make me an expert, but I can pretend to be one. If you look even at the Tolkien movies, the Lord of the Rings movies, there was far more complexity, subtlety. The acting was far superior. The script was quite beautifully written. And I thought it was more beautiful. I didn't even find this a very beautiful movie after the initial 15 minutes. I was used to what I was seeing, and I found it very repetitive.
Simone, how should we interpret the mystical and pure connection that the Na'vi seem to have with nature?
Well, I think one of the things I want to talk about with the film and how we can interpret what's happening is how it's being taken up around questions of environmentalism. So is it that we can see people that are having their spaces destroyed and in the pursuit of profit or raw goods or materials, can it get us in the real world and not in the avatar world to ask questions about these things, about our own complicity in environmental destruction? And I think maybe just the idea that when you left the movie theater, you recycled your glasses. Maybe that's the only thing that Avatar will allow us in terms of environmental impact.
That was good.
I mean, I think one of the issues that maybe Simone can talk about is how racist the film is. I mean,
well, hold off on there. We're not going to go there yet because we're going to take the criticisms in order here. The first thing we're going to get. I got a list here, Peter.
Right.
Stick with me here.
On racism.
Yeah, and that's racism in itself,
but those things aren't delinked, Yeah, it's very true. But we'll get to that.
But yeah, we're going to get to that. Simone, let me stick with you because, of course, one of the things that this picture has done allegedly, according to some, is that it has portrayed the people who seem to be American-like soldiers in a very negative way, and that hasn't happened a lot in motion pictures lately. Now, you're a Canadian living in the United States. How are Americans responding to this sort of anti-American, anti-military theme that runs through the picture?
Well, I think because we had in this film the Jake Sully character, the ex-Marine, I think it allowed a kind of forgiveness for that character, the kind of Blackwater, the character with the scar, the colonel who was really the bad guy and the real meanie in the movie. So I think that, you know, it's kind of give and take, but there was a negative portrayal, but it kind of, the film itself allowed a rebirth of this particular character in a sense, and I think masculinity and whiteness in general. So I think there's a lot of forgiveness there. I don't think that we necessarily would see that as a poor reflection of America.
And of course, the bad guy is, and I think this is quite significant, a Southerner. And if you look at the history and ask any Southern actors what roles are they offered, it's generally a Confederate soldier, a Klansman, or some sort of lunatic. And the caricature of that man, and of course he pushes weights as well, which means he must be evil. And then the other bad guy eats throughout the movie. Now that's very bad directing. When you have a character who's eating constantly to show they just don't care about other people. The Australian playing the American who was the good guy who in the end did rescue them, that meant Americans are generally, in the end, okay.
Well, I wanted to go even further, Jordan, and ask you whether you think that this movie, in fact, is an indictment on all of Western-style civilization. Want to go that far?
Well, it's a piece of propaganda, fundamentally. And I said it had a mythological structure. But what it really does is that it parasitizes mythological power to give it whatever power it has. And the reason it's propaganda is because it presents things in a terribly one-sided manner. So nature is perfect. Culture and the military is absolutely evil. It's like, well, no, nature isn't perfect. I mean, nature is cancer and parasites and freezing to death and
earthquakes in Haiti.
plague-carrying mosquitoes. And yeah, nature is, you know, red in tooth and claw. And culture, well, you know, you got to think that Cameron's movie was a technological masterpiece because he's a great admirer of technology, except that he seems to have absolutely no gratitude to technology. It's kind of like Gore in that regard, I think. And so it's propaganda partly because it's one-sided and partly because it's ungrateful.
Geoff, is it an indictment of Western civilization?
Yeah, well, maybe it is, but if it is, it's a very, very safe indictment. I mean, the other thing about Avatar is that Avatar is a movie that, apart from the technology, is really taking no risks whatsoever, right? If it were taking risks, then it would be more direct in whatever it's trying to say about the American military. Like, I don't even know, is it now an American planet? Does this represent the entire planet? Like, that kind of stuff isn't even dealt with. And if he really wanted to deal with racism and environment, he'd deal with a real environment and he'd deal with a real race if he was really interested in doing that. And I don't think he is. I think that this depiction of the rapacious, corporate, militaristic stuff, it's completely safe. These are easy villains, these are easy heroes, these are easy subjects.
You saw District 9, obviously. That
Absolutely.
was a lot more shades
far
of gray.
more interesting, far more interesting. Hurt Locker, another major nominee, incredibly more, you know, infinitely more interesting movie than this one.
I want to read something from the National Post here. David Boas wrote this from the Cato Institute, and the National Post published it a couple of months ago. Conservatives see Avatar as anti-American, anti-military, and anti-corporate or anti-capitalist, but they're just reacting to the leftist ethos of the film. They fail to see what's really happening. People have traveled to Pandora to take something that belongs to the Na'vi, their land and their minerals under it. That's a stark violation of property rights, the foundation of the free market and indeed of civilization. Sure, the Na'vi probably view the land as their collective property. At least for human beings, private property rights are a much better way to secure property and prosperity. Nevertheless, it's pretty clear that the land belongs to the Na'vi, not the Sky people. Now that's a story conservatives ought to be able to understand. Now you say oi, 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 but I'm going to ask you whether you think conservatives ought to be rallying behind this picture given that message.
Yeah, I did see the invisible hand of the market throughout the movie. Absolutely. You know, Adam Smith, that little drop-in role. Yeah. This guy has too much time on his hands. And, Hollywood is anti-conservative. It's the set position. It doesn't matter very much. There are messages that can be read in many Hollywood movies. Just enjoy them as movies. It's so clumsy and flimsy to even use such an analysis is pointless. I don't really care what the message is, particularly if it is a good movie, if it's a fun movie. The messages from it? Look, full of irony, full of paradox, full of contradictions, and I don't think Cameron would even know what they were. You're watching with 3D glasses, all of this advanced technology, so you can admire people who despise technology. The natives cannot save themselves. It takes a white man to say, let's do it this way.
We're going to get to that.
Okay, we're going to get to that.
We're going to get to that.
So, remember, this is Titanic. The Titanic was built in a dockyard where Roman Catholics were not allowed to work. If they turned up for work, white-hot bolts of this size were thrown at them. The whole nature of British imperialism, what the Titanic... The movie is all the working class people are hugging and dancing, whatever their ethnic background. It was just like that, Steve.
Another James Cameron picture.
And on deck, it's all, I say, you're a swine, I think I'll stab you in the back. Cliches and caricatures, whether they're on board a large ship that's going to sink or whether on this planet, I think it's the same Cameron.
I think the expression is, he's laughing all the way to the box office, though.
Yeah, I wish I was his friend.
Jordan, you wanted to say?
No, I can't remember what I was going to say.
Okay, well, let me pick up on that. Let me go to the woman who is sitting in a little tiny blue patch of the biggest red state in the United States and ask her whether that conservative message, as enunciated by the fellow from the Cato Institute, is resonating at all down there.
I mean, it could, but some people would rally around a tea bag if they could. I think, you know, some of the
they're doing that, aren't they?
I think so. But you know, the film, I think it does allow us to think about a lot about Western culture. And one of the elements that really struck me was the character of Jake Sully, who went there to get his legs back because he couldn't have access to health care. You know, and I think that's something that could resonate with the conservatives. But it also lets us think about the idea that only certain bodies can live a full human existence or a full Navi existence, and that you have to be able-bodied. So if it can get us to question, I mean, this falseness around able-bodiedness and movement and being human, I think it's a good thing.
Okay, Peter, let me try this with you. Some critics have argued that the lifestyle that the Na'vi demonstrate in this movie is far too beautiful, far too harmonious, far too lovely for a culture that is supposed to be really primitive. And the question, I guess, is would we really feel this kind of sympathy and empathy for the Na'vi if we saw their daily life as being really as primitive is normally?
Yeah, I don't understand why there are, apart from having wanted to get FaceTime because of this movie, why there are indigenous groups that have signed up in, you know, putting ads about protest about the film. In the film, and I'm just echoing Michael, the film depicts these people as if they haven't figured out that bows and arrows don't work against helicopters, and they need a white Marine to tell them and to rally them together. I mean, this is such a cliche from colonial film for films over the last, I don't know, 15, 20 years. Pocahontas and all these films, Dances with Wolves, you know, you got to wait for the white guy to come along. I mean, they're sophisticated. In the book, I keep referring to this book. This is a book about an activist survival guide about this. But in the book, there's a whole tradition that the Na'vi have. They have songs, they have music, they have a whole culture and so on. None of which shows up in the movie. What shows up in the movie, their whole sort of cultural apparatus, is what I refer to as the Road to Zanzibar scene, where they sway backwards and forwards in front of this vast tree, and it's straight out of those movies, MGM in the 1950s, where they'd say, what we need now is we need an African dance scene. Can we have an African dance scene? And they do this kind of swaying thing, and that's the really powerful cultural moment.
By the way,
in the film.
It's what CBC TV does whenever they want to depict native people now. Some sort of drumming and chanting. So let's not pretend we've gone past the 1950s. Not all of us have.
Okay, Jordan.
Part of it is there's a noble savage idea underneath it that goes along with the idea that the planet is paradise. So, you know, there was an old European idea, and that any culture that was unspoiled by civilization, and this is a Rousseauian idea, was going to be natural and pure, and that's exactly what you see here. And the truth of the matter is that among most smaller tribal human organizations, the rate of male-on-male homicide, for example, is spectacularly high. So they tend to be relatively brutal interpersonally. So, but it's part of the mythology. If you're living in paradise, and Pandora, by the way, is a very weird name for paradise, right? Because Pandora is the box out of which all the trouble comes.
Correct.
Which is the missing part of Mother Nature in the movie.
Are we going to discuss gender? Is that on your list?
Oh, and I wanted to say something about the hero, too. Sully isn't the hero. His girlfriend's the hero. And really, because Sully is
the
this...
idea that we don't know her name is that just shows really about
well,
how
that
Jenner's
has
operating
more
in
to
that
do
film.
with my memory than the movie. But she purifies him, because he's a crippled military character. And she purifies him with her soul, and her soul is a representation of the purity of nature. So it isn't that he's there to save them, it's that she saves him. And then, because of the transformation that she represents, because she's nature too, then he can be on the right side.
I think to Simone's point, her name's Natiri.
Aha, Natiri.
Which
So
sounds
Natiri becomes the vessel through which he can transform, and I think that's good. But I think one of the questions to ask is, could the film have been made without the Jake Sully character? Could Natiri have done her own saving of her people on her own without this character? And I don't necessarily think that that film ever would have been made.
I don't think it would have been conceived by James Cameron. I don't think so at all. No, I don't think so.
Because why? Because the notion of a female...
No, because I think that and I would bet that book that Peter's been showing us, which provides the background, was probably written in a panic after the movie was released, saying we got to fill this stuff in. We're going to get asked questions, and so Cameron put a whole team of people to write in a sort of a back history. What I'm talking about is that all of this is basically when Peter was describing movies in the 1950s, I was, of course, also thinking of the requisite volcano sacrifice that used to take place in all of those movies, right? This movie is just like one basically scene short of a volcano sacrifice. And we are all, when we talk around this, we're talking around that big hole, which is the hole in the script. And I think part of the reason why one is able to project as ridiculous an argument as the one that you read to us, with all due respect earlier, Steve, is the fact that is that it's a blank screen of a movie. Yeah. It leaves it's sucking all of this debate into it because there is nothing there.
It's Rashomon.
Yeah,
you can put whatever you want there.
Well, and one of the problems is that if you suppose you actually want to make a film that's got a serious ecological myth in it, like ones that we've talked about. The problem with the James Cameron case is that in a whole range of his films, he has this. He has to descend in his own personal pathology. Yeah. His own personal pathology is a mother and child that need protecting from an invasive father with a large machine gun. Yeah. And that's, of course, it's over and over again in these films. And the only way that the father with the large machine gun can be stopped is by a woman picking up a machine gun and starting to smoke, like Sigourney Weaver in the film. I mean, this is what constitutes his version of strong female is with guns and they smoke cigarettes. So you have a botanist in this film who knows nothing as far as I can tell about botany. She looks into microscopes
we haven't talked about the smoking actually. Anybody smoke here on this group? No. Anybody smoke? No.
But it's a signal. It's a signal that Sigourney Weaver is tough. You see, because in Aliens she's
tough. It's 200 years in the future, isn't it?
Yeah,
so
2150 it takes
still
place.
Smoking cigarettes 200 years in the future.
Well, she does anyway.
If they're tough. Wait, what was it? Apocalypto, the Mel Gibson movie.
Mad Max?
No, Apocalypto was which I thought was actually quite effective and largely successful and covered these sort of issues, but with a greater deal of reality. It showed both good and bad in any culture as they would be. There was a moment of pathos at the end, and of course Gibson has to be hated because
as well as a pathological creator behind it. Yes, right.
Possibly so.
Another
one with far more talent than Mr. Cameron, I would argue.
But the last hour and a half of the film is really James Cameron working through this. That's why it all turns into guns and people killing each other on a large scale, and men with large, these machines. They got to put in themselves in these big machines.
Do you know this for a fact about Mr. Cameron, or you're just construing this?
There's a professor of psychology sitting opposite me, so I have to be careful.
Well, he must be right then, of course.
But you can see this over and over again in his films. There's a mother and child together, and then there's this invasive father who comes in with a large gun. Well, they have to stop it.
Let me come at it, Geoff, from the other side, which is you pointed out a few minutes ago that there are all sorts of ellipses in this thing. There's all sorts of backstory that we don't have. Do you think we would have felt, this is sort of admittedly speculation here, would we have felt more compassion for the Earthlings, for lack of a better name for them, if it was explained somewhere in the movie why they were mining for this, whatever it's called, unobtainium or whatever?
Well, I think it would certainly make the film just a little bit more complex, right? It would, and I think that probably, in my old age, what I'm looking for is a movie. What I'm looking for from a movie is no longer pure sensation, believe it or not. I'm actually looking for something that my mind can engage with, and I want to be taken on a journey that can be as old-fashioned and traditional as the development of a character. And one thing that I find interesting about this movie is that if you just respond to the movie's rhythms, if you just respond to it as a visceral experience, is it not interesting how it kind of lurches alive only when it's destroying this planet it claims to love? The movie's real heat all the money shots, everything are contained in the destruction of this environment after we have spent 2 hours celebrating it. And I just say that that's something that is very much, I think, an interesting part of this film. Is that I think there's an internal contradiction at work.
Sorry, let me follow up with Simone on that, because did you see this movie in a theater with other people, or was it a private screening, or how'd you see it?
No, with other people, yes.
With other people. Was there any discomfort in the American movie theater in which you saw this at what appeared to be the violence directed towards the American soldiers towards the end of the picture? Any discomfort with that?
Not that I noticed. No, not that I noticed. I think we're just so accustomed to violence and seeing real war on television. So I don't think there was really any discomfort. Maybe just some boredom. You know, I was waiting for Jason Bourne to show up and actually do something.
But Matt was busy somewhere else. Okay, you wanted to
yeah,
see it.
yeah. So I don't think so.
It's useful to think, at least to some degree, about why the movie was so popular. You know, so we talked about the reasons of technology, and people are sophisticated enough to be looking for cutting-edge technology, and they like the visuals. But it is definitely the case that he taps into appropriate mythological themes, you know, and I don't think the movie is that far off Star Wars in that aspect. I mean, the natural paradise, for example, that Natira is part of, is presented as a kind of collective harmony. You know, there's a deep idea in the idea of collective harmony, because if you come to a good agreement with people, everyone in the agreement is happy with the agreement. And those sorts of things tend to be stable. And so what Cameron is pointing to some degree, is that utopia, which would be paradise, which is this movie, is composed of a state where everything is put together in harmonious balance. And there's something about that that's true, and that's partly why the movie has power. And like, there are themes in it that drive it. The problem with it is it's too one-sided, you know. And my son said something interesting about the movie. He's a teenager, and so I think he's more like the target audience. But he said, and I don't know if this is appropriate or not, but that it was a technological showpiece, and do you really want to clutter that up with a complex plot and complicated characters? Because the point was the technological showpiece, and it had a basic story which had an appropriate mythological theme, despite its, you know, appalling simplicity.
I think Cameron, though, I don't think Cameron set out to put in very simplistic, facile characters. I think he assumed he was providing us with something fairly complex. Look, this hand-me-down pantheism. I don't want to be too profound about this. It's just a silly movie. But hand-me-down pantheism, people are moving, well, some people are moving away from what they think is organized religion. The rather gullible, with all due respect, I don't mean you, but acceptance of anything that is associated with climate change and global warming, the movie plays into that. We have a very dumbed-down, numbed-down culture. Oprah has the final answer on most things. We shouldn't really be surprised the movie is so successful. Beautiful, unchallenging, confirms our stereotypes anyway, brings in the environment, and isn't God a bad thing, and religion's really very nasty.
It's all there.
A great movie.
Yeah. Okay, let's...
if I was a pagan, I would be offended by the film. I think the way in which it deals with the way in which it deals with the sacred spirituality by native train is absurd. You know, worshipping of the one great tree. I mean, okay, there were druids once, but you know, all the pagan religions that I have any knowledge of are extremely sophisticated, very complex, and are you know, saturated in very specific daily rituals.
Okay,
this is a movie version of it.
This pagan is not a pagan, but he wants to move the discussion, and I guess I'm going to pull a line from Clint Eastwood here and say I'm going to go ahead and make your day. We're going to get to the racism angle, which I know you all want to talk about. And now I'm not going to quote somebody from the Cato Institute, but rather from the New York Times, David Brooks, whom I suspect most of you know and respect. Avatar, he writes, is a racial fantasy par excellence. The hero is a white former Marine who is adrift in his civilization. He ends up working with a giant corporation and flies through space to help plunder the environment of a pristine planet and displace its peace-loving natives. The white guy notices that the peace-loving natives are much cooler than the greedy corporate tools and the bloodthirsty U.S. military types he came over with. He goes to live with the natives, and in short order, he is the most awesome member of their tribe. He has sex with their hottest babe. He learns to jump through the jungle and ride horses. It turns out that he's even got more guts and athletic prowess than they do. He flies the big red bird that no one in generations has been able to master. Along the way, he has his consciousness raised. The natives help the white guy discover that he, too, has a deep and tranquil soul. Okay, Simone, start us. Does this film have racist undertones?
I think is very formulaic. We had all of the trappings of a story about race, the civilizing mission, the noble savage, a white guilt. But I think, let me just give you an example. So I think there were two parts of the movie where the same character, the kind of Colonel Blackwater character, said we're going to blow a crater that's going to wipe out their racial memory. And then there's another scene where he asks Jake Sully, he says to him, how does it feel to have betrayed your race? So I think specifically the film was about race. But I think we should see, I want us to make just different films about race that ask us better questions about it. And I think that this was a lost opportunity in that sense.
Geoff, racist undertones in the picture?
Well, but again, so far under that you really have to reach down to, I think, come up with anything solid. I think that, and Jordan may be able to speak to this. I mean, the mythology reaches back to captivity narratives, right? Which is basically about the turning of the white settler who becomes either captured by or escapes to the indigenous people, the natives, and that experience. And I mean, the interesting thing about this is everybody's talking about Dances with Wolves. Okay, that's one thing. But there was a whole tradition of these movies in the 1950s. In the early 1970s, Richard Harris made a career out of making movies like Man in the Wilderness and A Man Called Horse. They were all about that. I mean, this is something, it's also something, and again, I would raise the point that if Cameron really and I think, as Michael says, I don't think this is a conscious attempt to be simplistic. I think probably sitting at home with nobody telling him otherwise, James Cameron's thinking, this was one hell of a movie. This is one hell of a... I think he's really thinking that. But I think that, if you want to make a movie about race, I think Simone's just, make a movie about race, deal with race. I mean, what we're looking at is this kind of idealization, a mashup of racial characteristics, dealing with hundreds of years of mythology, which again is a safe way of not dealing with the issue of race.
It's a movie about the idea of race.
The idea of race, exactly.
That's not the same thing.
Yeah.
Plus, it's not exactly clear which race is on the right side.
They're blue.
So, well, yeah, it's species, not race, so that's worth pointing out. But, because they're noble savages, they aren't real. They're figments of the imagination. And so the whole movie is a figment of the imagination, and I suppose that's okay because it is a movie. But I don't really think it's about race. So,
well, sorry.
Peter?
Pigments of the imagination. They have tails. I mean, I think that it's overtly racist, but it's disguised as a sort of an attempt at a sort of attack on colonialization. But it itself is just falls into all of the cliches about colonialism.
You're a Buddhist, right?
Mm-hmm. I am, yes.
The non-Judeo-Christian religious aspect of the Na'vi people, if I can put it that way, does that add to their racial stereotyping?
Yes, especially the way they dance. No, it's astonishing, and it's even more astonishing when you actually try and work out what the religion is, because it's a worship of a form of the internet. It's this notion that somehow that it's not just that everything is all interconnected. Buddhists are quite happy with that, but that it's really easy to join the interconnection by just plugging in. And if you can plug in, you become immediately part of nature. That's part of the magical power of it, and it's part of the way in which it talks about film. And that's not how human beings have to deal with nature.
It's not all that non-Judeo-Christian. I mean, there's paradise. Mm-hmm. There's a tree in the middle of paradise. Right. There is the idea that paradise is a desired state that can be broken.
No snake on the tree, though. Mind you, they've got Adam and Eve, so...
That's right. That's
not specifically Christian. It's not quintessentially
I didn't
Christian.
say it was specifically Christian.
There are many myths that have that as part of... part of this is also the decline of the Soviet Union, in that our enemies were always very easy. They were Russian, and they dressed in a certain way. You had to find new bad guys. Interesting, if you notice, they make sure there are lots of black soldiers at the end when they're being rounded up. Now, there are many black men in the American Army, but they made a point of that. Who are the new bad guys? And there's a great deal of confusion in Hollywood. It used to be very easy, now it isn't. It's actually quite self-loathing. The people who are the bad guys are us. Oh my golly, what do we do? I don't know, we embrace some Eastern religion, and we say we like environmentalism, and we make a movie like this and make lots of money, and everyone is content.
Simone, you want to come back at that?
I just didn't want to get away from the question of race, and I think one of the things I wanted, like a movie that is so explicitly about race, how it is in our contemporary moment when we think we're in a post-racial society, that race can be evacuated, that we can say this is really not about race when it is. And I just want the audience really to demand to make movies and to go to movies where it doesn't take someone to come in and save you for yourself. You know, it's like, what does it mean when an oppressor someone comes to your planet explicitly to oppress you and ends up saving you? And I think we could just ask better questions and make better films and demand them.
Well, let me follow up on that with Geoff then. Why is it that we are still making, in the year 2010, movies that are apparently extremely popular that have got the white guy riding in on the horse to save a bunch of people who are not white.
Well, I think it's the safest bet. It is the safest narrative
Because
bet.
the
I think you
audience is
can
all white?
yes, you can still reasonably presume that if the audience is not all literally white, then they have a sensibility that is white when it comes to watching popular entertainment. So
Exactly.
therefore, the easiest thing, the easiest point, the safest assumption, the safest assumption you can make about widest audience appeal is by sending the heroic white guy in, and you give him a set of flaws, and you give him something to redeem himself and something to overcome. And an awakening of consciousness, and that is the easiest story to tell. And this is part of the thing which is, I think, absolutely fundamental to Avatar's appeal, apart from the technology, is it tells the easiest story possible.
Well,
Yeah.
but Simone, let me follow up with this. Isn't Neytiri, I mean, she's really the hero in this movie, isn't she? In which case, is it not as formulaic as everybody around this table seems to say it is?
But I think if we equate the mammy into the formula, then it's still this racialized woman. We can imagine Zoe Saldana as a Black Latina woman, who then helps this white character, Jake Sully, to become who he is. That he gets that. I think she could have flown that pterodactyl thing. She didn't have to explain it to him. So I don't necessarily think she was the hero.
That actually
and,
makes it sexist, by the way, not racist.
Women are very bad drivers of dinosaurs.
Here we go.
Exactly. So yeah. So I think so. But I mean, I guess there are more serious questions that we can ask about race outside of this film. But that we're talking about it. I mean, we always need to be talking about these things. That's what I think makes the film important. That we can actually have these discussions.
So what do you think it's going to take to move beyond this kind of stereotypical Hollywood storyline that Geoff says is just so easy and we don't seem to be able to get beyond?
I guess funding other types of directors and stories to get into film school, to taking a chance on certain types of scripts, and maybe putting more money into independent film.
That will never happen. That will never happen.
No.
Never happened.
Well, no, because
There are
these
lots of
stories
good
are
movies.
these stories
Maybe
are so
on Pandora.
basic. You know, there's going to be well, yeah, maybe there's going to be a small audience for intellectually complex and sophisticated films, and there's going to be a
Exactly.
whopping audience for stories that extract their themes from basic mythological narratives, and that is never going to change. So
I don't agree. There are challenging movies that do well. It depends on the quality of the movie. And there are all sorts of
Yeah.
movies that take a very different analysis of contemporary society, and they either go to their bad movies. We've just elected a man, well, we haven't, but they have down there, to the White House, largely based on mythology. Ask most people who voted for Barack Obama, not a white man as far as I know, what does he represent, what does he stand for, what are his policies? They have no idea, but the mythology is he will solve all of our problems. So people can be simplistic and facile beyond the movie industry.
of course.
Okay, we're coming into the home stretch here, and let's do our final chapter here, which we're calling More Than Entertainment, ? From the Boston Globe. Avatar is merely the latest white man's romance, and it hits every stop in the playbook. The broken hero who finds renewal by leaving his decadent people, who joins a tribe of noble savages and becomes purified, who leads his new children to victory because they can't lead themselves, and becomes a legend in the doing. Tarzan has been here, and Herman Melville, and so is Kevin Costner. As a cultural cliche, it reflects profound disgust with the society of men and a yearning for authenticity, for a connection deeper than anything our fallen modern world can provide. Michael Coren, is he onto something here?
I think we pretty much said what he has written in this piece. There is a danger, though. We're all sitting here on TV, smugly saying it's such a bad movie, and millions of people went to see this movie, and their lives weren't changed, but they were slightly happy at the end of it. And I feel rather mean criticizing it in such a way. Yes, it isn't a good movie. Pretty much everything about it, almost every aspect, is weak. Even the acting is not particularly good. Some good actors in this movie, but they didn't act well in the particular movie. But why did it do so very well? If we could turn this into a formula and give it to every other director and producer, here it is, make the movie, you know they would do it. You mentioned earlier Cameron laughing all the way to the bank. He does have something. He had it with Titanic as well. I wanted the thing
And
to
Terminator.
sink. I was bored, yes. Well, Terminator I thought was a good movie. I thought actually Terminator was something
It was.
different. He went wrong afterwards, but he's still doing very well, and I don't quite understand why.
Jordan, is there something, does the movie tap into something, I don't know, maybe there's a kind of
Well, the idea
a
of
lack of satisfaction with the absence of spirituality in our lives, maybe something like that.
Well, and there is this dissociation from the renewing element of nature. I mean, most people are urban, so they romanticize nature, and it's understandable to some degree because you can't even see the stars in the city, and that's a lack. But the problem is the movie is too simplified. And so it gives people the wrong idea in a sense, because it fails to remind them that they should be grateful that they have a roof over their head, even though that house happens to be built on a patch of nature.
Simone, does it tap into a kind of a dissatisfaction with modern life? The lack of spirituality in our modern lives?
I don't know if it's the lack of spirituality, but maybe for some people the lack of space and home. And one of the interesting things that I think that came out of the film was in February, a group of Palestinian protesters dressed up as Na'vi to protest the building of, I guess, walls outside of Ramallah. And that got some news play. And if for maybe like a short moment, some people who wouldn't necessarily know about their conditions or really care could empathize for a minute because they're dressed up as Na'vi. I think that maybe is something where this kind of avatar gets put into reality for, repurposed for political protests. I think that's...
Well, let's follow up on that. You've touched on something there. I mean, Peter, the reality is this may be just a silly motion picture that apparently not too many people around this table like, but the fact is that a century-long, almost century-long conflict in the Middle East, one faction in that conflict decided it would be a good idea to dress up as characters from this motion picture in order to gain some attention for their cause. He has crossed over into something here, has he not?
Yes, and I think it's deeply problematic. Again, if you're the Na'vi, it suggests that you're primitive and that you don't understand that bows and arrows won't work against tanks. Well, there are victims and there are deep problems, but the way to deal with the issue is not in this kind of childish way. I'm not saying that Palestinians are childish, I'm saying that James Cameron's version of this is childish. And we have a Canadian example. 2 days ago in Variety, there was a full-page ad called Avatar Sands, and it was signed by 25 environmental groups and a number of First Nations about how James Cameron's Avatar should win the best Oscar because we have here in the world, we have our own Pandora unobtainium, which is the oil sands, and people have signed on to this. And I think they should have thought about it a bit more before they signed on to it. And the reason why they did it is because it's a battle about images, that human beings are now in such control over the planet that reality doesn't matter, really. The real nature is not very interesting. What's really interesting is who's in charge of the images, because the images will eventually control the natural world. And so that's why they want to have FaceTime with Avatar. So these people dress up in blue, and people sign on with pictures about Avatar so they can control how the images are going to be handled. Because reality is so less interesting.
What's very interesting about what happened outside Ramallah is that part of the contemporary Palestinian narrative is there's been a westernization of the area. It's relatively new. Certainly in the past 30 years, Palestinian groups have said, not even Americanization, but you've westernized what is, it may be less advanced and less sophisticated, but was something different. And it's not about anti-Semitism, but part of this, the Western Jewish influence has been to westernize. Yet they use what is a direct product of the worst of Western culture, a movie character, to demonstrate. Now that actually is pathetic in the real sense. It's terribly sad that Palestinians feel they have to do that. How self-defeating, but how very typical, I suppose, of the modern age.
Do you see the Palestinians as the Na'vi? Do you see that connection there?
Well, I think that people always feel that they're the Na'vi when they're being invaded. I mean, it's part of the invasion myth, right? It's like, well, we're the people who were the people, really, because most tribal names mean the people. And the force that's invading us is basically some version of dark and satanic, So, and that's what happens in this movie.
And can be dark
standard
and
story.
Okay, about 6 minutes to go here. Let me put a couple of more things on the table. Rayan Salam, who's been on this program, he's with the New America Foundation, has written that James Cameron's Avatar is an indictment of the kind of society that produces James Camerons. Are we being, okay, Simone, to you first, are we being a little too tough, a little too harsh on our own Western-oriented, Hollywood-loving, superficial civilization here?
Not at all, and we're having fun doing it as well too. So I think that's important.
Okay, Geoff?
I don't think you can ever be too tough on stupidity. I think the moment you let it go, you're in for big trouble. And I know there are all kinds of people out there who, probably people who are huge fans of them who aren't paying attention to discussions like this. They're not even having discussions like this. They don't care about discussions like this. And that's fine. But the fact is that when you allow any form of popular culture to just kind of float out there without any discussion, without any kind of context, then I think that that is remiss. That is a form of irresponsibility. And I think that I just want to pick up something about the complexity of the Israeli-Palestinian narrative, right? I can think of no more effective way of making the complexity of that particular narrative simplistic than by imposing the Navi on it. And that's one of the reasons why movies like this work, because they offer simple solutions
that's why
to
they're
everything.
propaganda. That's exactly why they're
simple
propaganda.
solutions to everything that's complex.
Yeah.
And that's why a lot of people don't want to hear conversations like this.
And you know, very frequently when a political argument is taken to a simplistic level, you know, like it turns into a form of pathological propaganda, and that is a bad idea. You know, like the idea that civilization is evil and that nature is good. That's not a very wise idea. You know, I mean, the average lifespan was probably doubled in the last 100 years, and it might be useful to be grateful about that instead of being only incensed by it.
Well, that's the question. Are we being too harsh on Western civilization in this?
It's
paper?
unbalanced.
And who's
It's unbalanced.
You know, I mean, civilization is terribly dangerous. There's absolutely no doubt about it. But freezing to death in a swamp is really dangerous too. So, you know, you're always stuck because you're vulnerable. You're stuck with the necessity of balancing fatal powers. And they can easily get unbalanced, and that's kind of what this movie's about. But you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Simone, the camera didn't catch it, but I did. You just had the most quizzical look on your face. What was that all about?
just about civilization and life rates. I mean, that's really happening not for everyone, and even in the country I'm in now, when we think about the disparity between black-white ways of living and life and access to healthcare. So I think that when we can bring questions like this to the fore around access, even if the film allows us to think about political protest or allows us to think about our complicity with environmental degradation, I think it's important in that way.
Okay. Peter, how about you
so
on this?
talking about civilization is good.
Talking about civilization.
Gandhi's famous quote, he was asked what he thought about Western civilization. He thought, I think it would be a good idea.
He was a product of it. He wouldn't have been the man he is unless he had studied under British education. Part of his arrogance, by the way, was also part of his British education. Civilization, by its nature, what the word means, it is a very good thing. The problem with the movie is it doesn't begin the conversation. In many ways, it ends the conversation. It says nothing about environmentalism. It says nothing about race. So we're not provoked into thinking more and harder and
it
deeper.
says the conversation isn't worth having.
Yeah,
basically.
that's right.
It's
Yeah.
done. It's finished. Yeah.
And Churchill has the right rejoinder to that sort of attitude too, which is that, democracy is a terrible form of government except for all the other forms.
Yeah.
And you can say the same thing about civilization. It's terrible, obviously. It produces tanks and murderous robots and atom bombs and so forth, but it lets James Cameron make a $300 million movie about saving the planet.
And I was
and lets David Suzuki fly all around the world in jumbo jets too.
And if by Western civilization we mean cowboys and Indians, I think it actually reflects pretty well on Western civilization.
Okay, one last thing here. I want to ask, and I'll start with you, Geoff. You're the film critic here. How ticked off are you going to be Sunday night if at around probably, I guess it'll be Monday morning, 12:06 a.m. Monday morning, James Cameron is walking up onto that stage with a golden statuette in his hand and telling everybody, guess what? I'm the king of the world again.
I'm a little too zen about that these days. Whatever happens, happens. I've learned to accept it. It's no personal reflection on me. It doesn't necessarily mean the universe is spun out of control, and I will not be watching.
You won't be watching?
No.
You don't watch the Oscars?
No. It's a lot easier to just take sleeping pills and lie down on the floor.
Okay. How can a film critic not watch the Oscars?
By caring about movies, Steve. We'll have this discussion some other
Okay.
time.
Do you know about Sacha Baron Cohen, by the way? He was going to appear dressed as an avatar, saying he was carrying the love child of James Cameron. And Cameron, being the great egalitarian, said, if this happens, I'm walking.
Oh my goodness, really, I hadn't heard that. Simone, if he wins the Best Picture for this, you're going to be upset?
No, because I won't be watching it either. So
I thought 6 billion people watch this thing every year, and I've got 2 people on this
They all
program.
deny it, though.
They all deny it.
I'll be
I guess.
watching.
without, yeah.
I'll be looking at the moon.
You're not going to watch it either? Give me a break.
Well, how important do you think the technological element of the movie is? I mean, that's relevant, right? I mean,
Sure.
He did push the envelope in terms of what technology is capable of doing,
done
and
something
that's
new.
not worth nothing. I mean, the plot, and the characters were pretty simplistic, but the movie wasn't a catastrophic failure in all regards. So
if it
and
wins
it
Best
was-
Picture, you're okay with that?
No, I like The Hurt Locker. I think it's a way better movie.
Although, did you read the piece in the paper today about that one?
No.
Oh, just that the kind of accuracy about how these guys did what they did is apparently soldiers are laughing as they watch that movie because it's so unrealistic from what really happens. So, okay,
Shows
well,
you what I know.
You know what? No, it just gives you another reason not to watch the Academy Awards on Sunday night.
But it is a movie.
I would recommend instead getting a video of Fern Gully.
Yes, we know that's your favorite.
Pocahontas.
Okay.
Dances with Wolves. Bambi. You know, films with real serious ecology in them.
Okay, last word to Michael Coren on whether he's going to be watching the Oscars Sunday night and whether he either hopes or doesn't hope that James Cameron goes home with a statue.
Well, unlike these elitist snobs around here, I will be watching, because it's quite fun. You sit there with popcorn or whatever and shout at the kids. I will be watching. It may... Golly, the number of bad movies that have won, no, I'm not Zen, I don't even know what that is, unlike Geoff, but I'll just sit there and you have another beer, and then it won't matter very much at all.
But at least you're going to be watching.
Sure.
Okay, good on you. Can I thank all of our guests for participating in tonight's program, starting with, shall I go out of town first? Simone Browne at the University of Texas, Austin. Simone, those of us in Toronto, send you greetings from your old hometown, and thanks for being on the program tonight. Nice to have you.
Thank you.
Geoff Pevere on the left-hand side of the table, along with Jordan Peterson from the Toronto Star and University of Toronto, respectively. Michael Coren, whose latest book is called As I See It.
Thank you, sir.
Plug away, plug away. And Peter Timmerman from York University. Good to have both of you on the program tonight as well.